similar to other stuff.
Live streaming is on.
We'll do okay. But good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just getting us set up. Brian will jangle keys for your amusement while I post links, then we can get this show on the road.
Oh. It's not keys, but it's something new.
Good. I hope it's something bright and impressively shiny.
No, it's a hard drive.
Okay, hard drive instead of keys. Well, we don't want to get too predictable. Okay, so link posts. Got to share it again, and then we're good to go. Share to the page. One more time once that's up. That's up. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. As always, I'm your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist and the Paranormal Encyclopedia, and I am joined by
Brian McKinley, author and godfather of vampire thrillers.
I want to apologize about last week and the fact we did not do a show. With the election results having come in that night, I did not want to turn this, and I still do not want to turn this into a political show, and I felt too emotionally involved to avoid commenting on it last week. This week, I got a little more distance. The election's largely over, except for the continuing disagreements about and lawsuits, but we'll see what happens there, and I'm not going to talk about it. I do want to mention, though, that this is going to probably be the last show on a Saturday night. Because the good news is I have a new job that is going to be a nice pay raise for me. But my hours are going to change where I was off on Saturdays. I'm going to be working. So we're going to be moving to Monday nights. I think we're still going to stick to 6 o'clock. We can tune that up and down if we need to, because I'll be off on Saturdays or on Mondays now. So we can do it later if we need to or earlier. We'll figure something out there. But that's the plan going further. There won't be a show this Monday, obviously, because we're doing the show tonight. But next weekend, I would assume we will have the show on the 23rd instead of the 21st. Keep an eye on the Facebook for those updates. You can also, I usually put a note in the discussion part of the page. So if you're not on Facebook for some reason, and I know some people aren't, and if you're not, or if you're not subscribed to the page on Facebook, and you absolutely should be, then you'll be able to keep track of what's going on there. All the bookkeeping stuff taken care of for the moment. Let's get into tonight's topic. So tonight, we're actually going to be talking about cryptids. For people who may not know, because I suppose it's become pretty well known these days, but it's still a slightly obscure word, I think. Cryptids is the fancy term for animals that may or may not exist. Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster,
Bunyip.
Bunyip, Jackalope. It's basically anything that there's a serious debate over whether or not they actually exist or whether they continue to exist. It also includes some animals that did exist at one time. For example, there's a couple of critters that people have claimed to see in Africa and even parts of the United States that are supposedly dinosaurs. So dinosaurs certainly did exist once, just somewhere around the 65 million years ago.
Yeah, there's that prehistoric fish that
the coelacanth.
Coelacanth, that's the name. Yeah, recently found that.
Well, recently is like the 80s or 90s.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. That is a good example. There are, because it's a common question. Again, this is kind of what inspired it. Aside from one of my author friends mentioning that he's working on a book about a cryptid, and we'll be having him on once that's released.
Chubacapra.
Yes, Chubacapra is another famous example. But there are actually cryptid animals that at one time would have been considered cryptids that we know do exist. The coelacanth is a pretty good example in the fact that was supposed to be extinct for something like 30 million years. And they found a tribe, I want to say, in Africa that's been fishing for them for years.
Yeah.
Didn't think they tasted very good, but caught them pretty regularly.
Yeah, it was kind of an ugly-looking fish.
Yeah, go ahead and look it up, folks, if you're interested. It's a hideous fish. But it's what they sometimes call a living fossil. It's something that despite what some people think, it has actually evolved since millions of years ago. It's not exactly the same, but it is very similar to the form it had in the time of the dinosaurs. And again, it fits into this cryptid category because people did think they were real. They just thought they were extinct. I'll say one of the ones that I've always found the most amusing personally is the giant squid.
Oh, yeah.
Because when I was in high school, and granted, Brian and I are old men, so when I say I was in high school, I'm talking about the 90s. My biology teacher was convinced that there was no such thing as giant squid. There was still a serious debate among marine biologists and oceanographers and whatnot about if giant squid existed. And then in 2004, scientists in Japan managed to get the first live video footage of a giant squid. And yeah, it's confirmed. There are enormous squid out there. It's something that was talked about in legends and in sailors' stories for hundreds of years, but the scientific community dismissed it as this couldn't exist.
Yeah.
Granted, there's some speculation there because my understanding they found sucker marks on whales because what does a squid that big eat? It eats whales. But if the sucker marks they find on some whales are indicative of the size of the animal, there may be squid out there bigger than the blue whales. We don't know. Granted, we don't know. And it's one of the things I've always personally thought when you talk about cryptids, I think the ones that are the most likely to exist, and I'm not saying that they do, I'm just saying I think that the most likely are things like sea serpents. Because we know more about the dark side of the moon than we do the ocean floor. If there's anywhere left on Earth you're going to find huge animals that science has no idea of the existence of, it's probably in the oceans.
True.
On land, it's much smaller. We find new species on land all the time. But it's insects, it's plants. It's not impossible, but it's improbable we're going to find something even the size of Bigfoot wandering around Oregon, for example.
No. The Himalayas, maybe.
Maybe, although even that area is common enough for tourists by now, I would expect somebody would have shot one and dragged it back.
Yeah. It's funny how many giant primate type things are on the cryptid lists. Like every area has some sort of giant primate.
This is true, and there's even the one that was confirmed to exist, which was the wild man of Africa. You know that story?
No, from Borneo?
No, Africa.
Africa.
So, 18th to 19th century reports start coming in to biologists and zoologists in Europe of these huge, hairy, very human-like creatures being seen in Africa. They're described as being able to walk on their hind feet. They're described as having human-like hands, human-like feet, very intelligent eyes. and people dismissed it for years. What eventually they realized, we now know what they were, though, and you can go see them in many zoos around the world. What people were describing was the mountain gorilla.
Oh, okay.
But the description was so fantastical, people thought it was a hoax. Another example, or it was a myth, it was a Bigfoot figure. Another really good example of this phenomenon is one of my personal favorite animals in all the world, which is the platypus. When the very first, when one of the first English biologists examined a actual dead specimen of a platypus that had been brought back to him from Australia in 1880, he was convinced it was a hoax. He thought it was like the Fiji mermaid that was basically a bunch of animals sewn together. What's ironic is he knew about the fact taxidermists had made hoaxes like this before. Like I said, the Fiji mermaid's very famous. It's a monkey that was sewed to the tail of a fish that later was bought, that was shunned by some people, and then later P.T. Barnum bought it and showed it as one of his oddities, as supposedly a real mermaid.
A real hoax.
Yeah. But that's what this biologist thought he was looking at. He couldn't accept the idea that something as bizarre as the platypus was a real animal, even though he had a specimen in front of him and there was no evidence of trickery. And let's face it, it's like the platypus is God's practical joke on evolutionary biology. I mean, it's got the bill of a duck, lays eggs. And the fun fact, it's not the only mammal that lays eggs. It's a mistake people make. People think that only the platypi are the only egg-laying mammals. And there's like 3 species of egg-laying mammals in the world. Platypuses are one of them, and then the other 2 are types of echidna. But, and for that matter, as you and our listeners may or may not know, male platypi have poisonous claws.
Yes.
It's a weird bloody animal.
It is.
And apparently when I was doing a little research earlier, like their genetics is pretty strange too.
Oh yeah, something mated that shouldn't have mated somewhere back in the evolutionary chain there.
Again, I think it's God's practical joke on evolution. Or maybe God just really got stoned. That's the other explanation.
It's the prevailing theory.
It's like, let's just stitch a bunch of things together and throw it out there so nobody will believe it exists.
Only in Australia.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
It's the island of misfit toys. It's the original.
But there are all of these other animals all over the world, some very well known. I mean, Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot are very famous, as is the Yeti, which is basically the Asian version. Yeah. And then there's ones in China and through parts of Europe and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
And people have been claiming to see these things for hundreds of years. I mean, Bigfoot legends go back to the native tribes before Europeans ever showed up and started claiming to see them. Although it's interesting just because some of the variety you find in legends, when people think of Bigfoot today, they tend to think of them as big and sort of harmless. And a lot of the old native legends, oh, no, they're vicious. They eat people. And there are legends of people being kidnapped by Bigfoot. There are legends of people being attacked.
Yeah. Well, you got to wonder something like that with as many different, legends that are similar around the world. You have to wonder if there's some kind of a common point there, some sort of factual thing that it's all based on. Maybe it doesn't exist anymore, but it did.
Or maybe it does, and we just haven't found it. I mean, there is enough open space in the world that it's unlikely, but it's not impossible that something like Bigfoot is still walking around out there.
Yeah, with all the hunting that goes on for it, you would think they'd find something definitive by now.
You would, and like I said, that's why I say I think it's unlikely. I don't want to absolutely say no, it can't be true, because that's no fun. And
No.
it's frankly, it's impossible to really prove something doesn't exist. I mean, if I walked out in my backyard right now, I 100% guarantee I won't see any wolves. Does that prove that wolves don't exist? No. It could. But the other thing I think you run into here, and I always find funny saying this, I think there's two factors to consider. One is that it's a wild animal we already know about that's gotten, changed by the storytelling.
Like bears.
Yeah, bears would be, particularly a bear suffering from mange would be a very likely explanation. Just like you mentioned the Chubacapra.
Yeah.
Every example of a Chubacapra they have ever found was a coyote with really bad mange. And if you look it up, coyotes with severe mange are freaky looking animals.
Mm.
But it's not a supernatural creature. The other thing that's always occurred to me with the Chupacabra is, so it's a small creature that feeds on the blood of goats and sheep and cattle at night, sometimes thought to fly. It's like, are we really sure that people aren't just talking about vampire bats and making up a more mythological version of them?
Yeah.
Because that sounds a lot like a vampire bat to me.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there's our favorite Garden State mascot, the Jersey Devil.
Ah, yes. Which is a good example of something I want to get into in a minute, but I want to stick, because I think there's some truth to the Jersey Devil, but I don't think it's a cryptid.
Mm.
I think a lot of these cryptids may not actually be cryptids like people think they are. But I want to linger on the physical side of it a little more before I get into that.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. I had an idea. I had a train of thought, and it's gotten derailed. Mass accident, hundreds dead. Oh, the humanity. Physical Bigfoot. No, that's what I was going to talk about with the physical, because there is actually a creature that some people still believe in that qualifies more or less as a cryptid, that is also based on a natural animal we know of, which is dragons. Dragons are based on something very real. But again, you have to go back to the earliest accounts. Actually, there's three creatures in this category I want to talk about: dragons, unicorns, and crocodiles. But if you go back to the older, especially the old European accounts of dragons, people don't see dragons in Europe. It's always knights out on crusade. It's people traveling to the Far East or the Middle East or Africa that see them. And in the oldest accounts, they don't have wings. They're really big lizards. Usually very snake-like, but mostly they're big lizards.
Yeah, because they were usually called worms.
Yes. And here's the other critical thing. Their bites, aside from breathing fire, their bites are often thought to be very deadly. Poisonous. Now, there is several thousand, tens of thousands, in fact, variety of lizard common to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. They can grow up to 10 feet. It has an extremely venomous bite. It's called a monitor lizard, or the most famous version of the monitor lizard, a Komodo dragon. So you have this knight that goes on crusade to the Middle East, to Israel, or the crusade that took place to Egypt, who encounters this gigantic 8-foot long, hundreds of pounds lizard that just needs to bite something and it will die very quickly, even if it isn't normally a fatal bite, because they actually carry venom sacs, and the fact that the mouths of reptiles are breeding grounds of bacteria. The bites of monitor lizards are almost always fatal. no matter where you're bitten, just because sepsis kicks in almost immediately. So even like you see the Komodo dragons, which are these huge hulking lizards. No, they won't like go out and bite an animal to death. They go out, they bite it, and then they back off and wait for it to die, and then they come back and eat it. Now, there's even an explanation for the breathing fire. Because, like many lizards, monitor lizards have a forked tongue. And if you look at some of the older drawings of dragons, it's not so much a ball of fire. It's a giant tongue with a lot of forks. So the knight comes back from the crusade and talks about fighting this huge poisonous lizard and how this huge tongue came out of its mouth. This huge forked tongue, like the devil is supposed to have a forked tongue. And maybe knights being knights, just like fishermen are fishermen, one fork becomes two forks, becomes four forks. The artist gets in on the act and little artistic license and adds more and more and more forks until what's coming out of the mouth no longer looks like a tongue, but looks like a ball of flame. But again, it's a very real animal. It's just artistic license and the fact that eyewitness accounts are extremely unreliable.
Yeah.
Turned it into this more classic idea. Yeah. 8 feet becomes 10 feet, becomes 100 feet, becomes this winged monstrosity that breathed fire down upon the land. And only the very holy knight could destroy it. Funny enough, there's also a story from the time of King Richard the Lionhearted of a knight named George who fought a dragon.
Mm.
The dragon in question had been picked up by King Richard while on crusade, and it was known to the locals in the area it was picked up as a crocodile. Which actually gets into another really good point, which is unicorns and the fact that unicorns exist. You can go see one in many zoos, and they're becoming sadly rare, but you can even see them in the wild. Do you know what unicorns are?
Rhinos?
Yes. If you read one of the oldest accounts of unicorns, which is from the book of Job in the Bible, it's Job 39, 9, 12. Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow, or will he harrow the valleys after thee? Wilt thou trust him because his strength is great, or wilt thou leave thy labor to him? Wilt thou believe him that they will bring home thy seed into thy barn? So it's talking about something that's like a horse. And very broadly, rhinos are a little like a horse with a horn. But it's something big and very powerful that you're not going to be able to domesticate. It's describing a rhinoceros. In fact, there's a type of rhinoceros, the scientific name for it, which is unicorn. The other one, actually, and there's two other examples in Job, which is behemoth, which is mentioned, actually all of these are mentioned a few times in the Bible. But Job is one of the more famous ones, which is Job 40, 15 to 24. Look at the behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly. Its tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are close knit. Its bones are tubes of bronze. Its limbs are like rods of iron. And ranks first among the works of the Lord, and its maker can approach it with his sword. The hills bring it their produce, and all the wild animals play nearby, hidden among the reeds in the marsh. The lotuses conceal in their shadow, and the poplars stream surround it. A raving river does not alarm it. It is secure through the Jordan, though the Jordan should surge against its mouth. Can anyone capture it by the eyes, or trap it and pierce its nose? Now, there's a little bit of debate about what this is describing. There's two animals. that are fairly like. Well, there's three suggestions, one of which is preposterous, and the other two of which are very likely. It's hard to be certain ones. The preposterous one is that particularly young Earth creationists have claimed that it's a dinosaur. That's basically a brontosaurus or brachiosaurus. And the main thing they hang this explanation on is the line that its tail sways like a cedar. There's two problems with this idea. One is it isn't its tail is like a cedar, because creationists will point out the tail of a brontosaur would be very long and thick like a cedar. It's that it moves like a cedar. And Middle Eastern cedars, the ones the author would have been familiar with, are much thinner and willowy. They move in the wind, like a tail swaying back and forth. The other possibility is look at the lines around it, talking about its strength in its loins and the power in the muscles of its belly. Another way I've seen people suggest this might be more accurately interpreted is that it's talking about its penis. And how big, basically it's saying the animal's got a really big penis. What it's actually describing, what here, at least, I mean, nobody knows for certain, given this was written thousands of years ago. Job's one of the oldest books of the Bible. But it's probably either describing an elephant or hippopotamus.
I was going to go with hippo.
The comment near the end about its nose and not being able to pierce its nose, I think is what usually makes people think of elephants. And that also thinking that maybe the tail thing is actually talking about the giant nose.
Mm.
But there's a pretty good interpretation, given both are herbivores. Both are absolutely enormous. And both, it's like a lone elephant is one of the most dangerous, is a very dangerous animal. They're normally very social creatures. To have a solitary elephant by its own means something is very wrong. And so lend credence to your own interpretation of it describing hippopotamus. Hippopotami are one of the most dangerous mammals on the planet.
Yeah, they kill more people than sharks.
That's not it. They kill more people than the great cats. And I don't mean lions. I mean lions, tigers, panthers combined. Saying they kill more people than sharks is an impressive. Sharks kill about 10 people a year.
Yeah, I know. It just sounds cooler.
I don't know. Killing more than all of the great cats put together is pretty damn cool.
Mm.
But yeah, they kill about 500. Hippos kill about 500 people a year, crushing them to death. Given they weigh about 3,000 to 9,000 pounds and are fiercely territorial. Hi, Sasa Nak. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. The last, and I'm going to just give the Bible verse instead of reading it because I want to move on, is the Leviathan, which is also described in Job. And you can find him in Job 41, which talks about this huge sea creature. Very fierce, very dangerous. You can't catch it with a fishhook. Normal weapons aren't going to hurt it. And again, more imaginative people have claimed that Leviathan is a dinosaur. More likely what it's actually describing is a crocodile.
Or a whale.
The description is pretty clear that it's talking about something that's at least more fits crocodiles than whales. But it is definitely describing something that's real. And something that we know of, not some...
I guess because I would picture Leviathan as being big.
It is big, but let's keep in mind that... Let me see. A saltwater crocodile, and it's more likely would have been thinking... The people writing probably were thinking of Nile crocodiles, which get up to be around 9 feet long, I want to say. But saltwater crocs, which are the biggest, can weigh a male saltwater croc can weigh in at about 2,200 pounds as an adult and reach lengths of 14 to 17 feet long. It's a pretty bloody big animal. It's not the sort of thing you're going to want to mess with. Particularly one reason I think it makes more sense to the whale is because it talks not just about trying to catch it with a fish hook, but it does talk about trying to attack it with weapons, and whales aren't really something you're going to try and stick with the sword. Usually. But on the other hand, a crocodile comes on land, and when they're talking about a Bronze Age level technology, their weapons aren't going to do a whole lot of good.
Even modern weapons don't do a lot of good against crocodiles.
Yeah.
Got to hit them in just the right spot.
And they're huge. They're also very aggressive. I mean, there's the one infamous crocodile Gustav in Africa who's killed a few hundred people. And I think a lot of these cryptids fall into categories like this. It's especially a lot of creatures from folklore and mythology. It's creatures that are real. They're actual events that get exaggerated with the retelling. You know, a knight fights a crocodile, becomes a knight fights a huge fire-breathing dragon. And that kind of thing. Sass, because they said to call them Sass, said that they used to watch Not Finding Bigfoot, but they did enjoy it.
I've seen some of that show.
I've never been a big on the cryptid thing, personally. I mean, when I was very young, I found them fascinating, and I wanted to go Loch Ness Monster and try and find, Loch Ness and find the monster. But as I've gotten older, I've kind of gotten further and further down the rabbit hole of demonology. I've gotten less and less interested in most cryptids. That said, I do have a take on Bigfoot, because that's also asked me what was my take on Bigfoot. And there's something really interesting about a lot of these cryptids. If you look at, the Sasquatch, Bigfoot is seen a lot around Native American areas where the Native Americans lived, the reservations, or areas that were important to them once upon a time before we kicked them off their land. If you look at the Yeti, it's found in Nepal and the other areas in the Himalayan mountains, areas that are very important to Tibetan Buddhism. If you look at the Loch Ness Monster, it lives on Loch Ness, which has a long history of various magical rituals taking place there, up to and including Aleister Crowley bought a home on Loch Ness and performed rituals. There's an idea that you find in a number of magical traditions. It goes by a couple of different names. In European magical circles, it's usually called an egregore, or a thought form. In Eastern magical circles, it's usually referred to as a tulpa. But the belief is that people that are very advanced in various mystic techniques can project something out of their minds, out of their imaginations. And if they focus on it powerfully enough, that thing can take on a life of its own. I think that a lot of these cryptids may very well be the tulpas. They may be thought forms. And that's why no one's ever found a dead body. That's why we've never found blood samples or anything concrete. Essentially, we're dealing with a kind of spirit. A directly related possibility is that that there's some kind of fairy creature, which would tie nicely into the fact that, while it's not often discussed, some sources will comment that Bigfoot sightings or creatures very much like Bigfoot are often sighted around places where UFOs are sighted. And as I've mentioned on the show before, I'm personally very much of the opinion that I'm of the opinion most UFO sightings are man-made aircraft. But I'm generally of the opinion that the ones that are not man-made aircraft are more likely to be fairies and spirits than they are to be alien life forms. I can't prove any of this, obviously. If I could, I wouldn't be doing a YouTube channel. I'd be rich.
We're rich from doing a YouTube channel.
True. I mean, if I could just concentrate real hard and make a creature appear out of thin air, I'd be rich. I'd be the number one guy on YouTube easily. It's like, let's have an interview with Bigfoot, and he appears behind me. But to simplify the idea, because Saz says, and I may be over other people's head, basically imagine an idea so powerful that it takes on a life of its own. Funny enough, and I haven't mentioned this to you yet, but I'm actually thinking about next week doing a look back because of the fact that this coming Thursday will be the series finale for Supernatural.
Okay.
And I've been watching that since I was a kid, but there's an episode of Supernatural that actually has a tulpa in it.
This is the X-Files as well.
I'm not surprised. But it is this idea. Basically, it's this creature created out of thought. And yeah, I do think it may explain a lot of these creatures. I think it certainly would make sense for why they're often seen in areas where some type of magical practice goes back hundreds or thousands of years. But you don't well, funny enough, you do sort of hear about them in and then if anybody's wondering, the episode in question is Hell House. Which is, according to the wiki is season 1, although I thought it was season 2, but I could be wrong. But episode 17 of season 1. I don't know where in X-Files the tulpa shows up.
It was in the newer
Okay.
seasons.
But it would explain a lot about why these creatures appear. Well, them being spirits in general would explain a lot of why these creatures are there and then gone. It might explain why they're blurry in photographs. Spirits are often not all that distinct. On the other hand, there's the vastly superior theory that the reason that Bigfoot's always blurry in photographs is he's just blurry. It's that blurry, hard to indistinct form you see in photographs is just what the guy looks like. Get off his case about it already. But it would explain some things. It wouldn't explain others. Because there are at least some accounts of people shooting and killing Bigfoot, which doesn't usually work so well on spirits. Although, again, it does beg the question of where's the body, where's the blood?
Yeah, exactly. That'd be a trophy for all time.
Yeah. I mean, people have brought back various things they claimed were Bigfoot hair samples, and I think even a few blood samples, but none of the DNA tests were conclusive. Or they just said it was a natural animal, a bear or gorilla or something.
Yeah.
I was going to say, and I had to correct myself, that you don't hear about a lot of these things in major cities, but that's not entirely true. Because there's a subset of cryptid called the phantom animal. Have you ever heard of that?
No, not specifically.
So there are there's a bunch of things you could call phantom animals, but the ones I mean specifically is people will see wild animals in the middle of major cities. But what makes it interesting is they'll see ones that are completely out of place, like lions roaming around Detroit, when neither the zoo nor any circuses in the area are reporting any missing lions. And there have been accounts, even police officers and things like that, chasing them, trying to shoot them, and again, there and then gone. Certainly, there are other explanations. The most obvious of which is lots of people keep stupid animals as pets that they really shouldn't.
Yeah. There are laws against that in a lot of cities.
Yeah.
Pet laws.
Funny enough, this just reminds me, and not paranormal, but it's a funny story, so I'm going to share it anyway. A woman I used to work with years back was Amish. Well, she had grown up Amish, and then she'd gotten ill, and she moved in with her aunt, who was more technologically savvy, so she could be closer to the hospital. And for insurance and all that, eventually got adopted. But when she moved off the Amish farm, she brought her dog with her. And the thing about the Amish, or at least her particular branch of Amish, I don't know if it's universally true, is they don't so much keep dogs as pets as wool. It was a wolf. And as she grew up and she eventually moved to New York City, she brought her wolf with her. Until one day when one of her neighbors, who was a police officer, said, "That's not a dog, it's a wolf, and you can't keep that in city limits." Though, for what she told me, funny enough, the animal was well trained, and it wasn't a wild wolf. It was it had been largely domesticated. It had grown up around humans. Its ancestors had grown up around humans. It was closer to wild wolves than most domesticated dogs. But because it was well behaved and well trained enough, the police actually adopted it and turned it into a police dog. Like I said, it's not paranormal, but I still find the story endlessly amusing, so I couldn't resist sharing. But yeah, people do keep animals they're not supposed to as pets. Sometimes the animals get too big to manage, and people will release them, which is, of course, the origin of the famous stories about alligators in the sewers of New York. Is for a while there was a fad of keeping alligators as pets in New York and other places. They got too big, people let them go, and a few of them did make their way into the sewers. Contrary to popular myth, they didn't grow to gigantic proportions and turn albino. Most of them quickly starved to death and died.
Yeah, sewers aren't really good hunting grounds.
They are if you want rats, but once an alligator gets to any sort of size, it's not really going to live off of rats very well.
Right.
But you have, and this actually all of this ties into another interesting. Well, there's a bunch of segues, I think, between cryptids and more spirit-based phenomenon, which is why one of the reasons I favor the tulpa explanation. One example of this that's very recent is the internet sensation that is Slender Man. This huge Victorian garb, creepy figure that's seen around playgrounds and schools and other children's play areas that supposedly abducts children. Now, the funny thing about Slender Man is it's a known hoax.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing started as a internet meme. As basically some website or other decided, let's make our own internet meme by using old-timey creepy photographs. That said, there have been people that have since claimed to see Slender Man. There's, of course, the very tragic case of the two girls being convinced that Slender Man wanted them to murder one of their schoolmates. I've known reasonably sober people in the paranormal community who seem to think there's something to Slender Man now. Which isn't to say that it was always real. One interpretation of this would be that enough people believing in it gave it form. A simpler spiritual explanation for this, and maybe for a lot of these other things, would be some demonic entity out there thought it'd be funny. Because that's a common thing I've run into over the years. Like we talked a few episodes back about Lovecraft. And we know that Cthulhu and Hester and the various other creatures of Lovecraft's friends' creations are not based on folklore. They're not myths. They're creations of fiction. But magicians will do rituals to summon them or gain power from them. the various rituals of the Church of Satan created by Anton LaVey invoke Cthulhu a lot. And you'll hear reports from magicians that this works. But there's also a school of thought in magic called chaos magic that suggests that the names and the symbols that you stick on these things don't matter that much. It's just you connecting to the power and how you associate yourself with it. And hello, Kimbles, is what matters. So there are, chaos magicians that work their magic calling on the Lovecraft, the Cthulhu mythos. There are ones that call on superheroes. Not claiming these things exist necessarily, but the symbolism is important enough and powerful enough.
We gather here tonight to summon the Batman.
Indeed. It's again a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other sort of question of, does our belief make these things real, or are spirits just screwing with humans? Because spirits, particularly fairies, love to screw with humans. It might just be, let's pick on the mortals' day. For that matter, one of my favorite, and you like it too, role-playing games, Shadowrun. There's a comment in one of the books that reports of Bloody Mary are usually just spirits screwing with human children. It's not some real murderous monster spirit out there. It's just spirits screwing with children, or some random spirit. Funny enough, the reality of Bloody Mary is it's not paranormal at all. Okay. Sass says, I must share, I'm 66 years old, and my grandmother believed in UFOs. She'd be 130 if she was alive today. Kimball's comments, if I was a spirit, I would have a lot of fun meeting with the living. So would I, to be completely honest. I mean, it's generally agreed among investigators and a lot of magicians that what spirits look like is largely based on their own, what they want to look like. They can look like just, particularly demons are famous as shapeshifters. They can look about just about anything they want. It's like, there's no real reason it can't just show up as a giant tentacled monstrosity if that's what the person summoning it wants to talk to. Our good friend Patrick Thomas has a funny take on that as well, for that matter. In his books, while the default form of the Grim Reaper tends to be the usual black-robed skeleton, he usually shows up as whatever people think death is supposed to look like. Up to at one point looking like Cthulhu. But it's hard to say, and of course the giant problem with this particularly theory of cryptids is it's phenomenally difficult to prove. On the other hand, I'd point out that people have been trying to prove the existence of Bigfoot for a very long time, and nobody's produced a body. So I don't think their theory is any better than mine. On the other hand, their theory is very easy to prove if it's true, which is bring us a dead Bigfoot. Yeah. Or even better, bring us a living Bigfoot.
Yeah, exactly.
Trank one and drag it back to society. But there are a lot of reports. There are a lot of reports from sober, intelligent people that know the outdoors. So while I'm not necessarily willing to believe that Bigfoot, there's giant gorilla men wandering throughout the United States, because they're seen they're seen in Pennsylvania, they're seen in Ohio, Oregon, and Washington are particularly famous for them.
Yeah.
I don't want to dismiss the idea entirely, up to and including, not for nothing, but famous badass President Teddy Roosevelt saw Bigfoot. And it's like, that was a man who spent a lot of time outdoors. He was a hunter. He knew wild animals. he's not really the sort of person to see a bear and go, Bigfoot!
Hmm.
It's not proof, but it does raise a question about the usual way that people interpret these sightings.
Yeah.
Because most skeptics are like, oh, it's just this, it's just that. And it's worth pointing out, people are very... This is a good point about skeptics, and I want to get to this, and I have something I want to circle back to about the connection between spirits and cryptids, because there's one I've deliberately left out. It's seriously been a plan all episode long, not just something I only just remembered again, that I want to get to, which definitely bridges the gap between cryptid and spirit being. But before I do that, the problem with a lot of skeptics is they tend to rush very quickly to an explanation that neatly fits into their worldview. And that's not really any better of a solution than rushing to a solution that's the paranormal. Perfect example of this is most of the, people listening, and Brian, I'm sure yourself as have I, growing up, the story I'd always heard is that mermaids are manatees, right? You've heard that before?
Yeah.
Which is really nonsensical for a lot of reasons. For a start, traditional sightings of mermaids are most common in Scandinavian cultures, which are mostly in the North Atlantic, where you don't find manatees, or the Mediterranean Middle East, where you also don't find manatees. Also, anyone who's ever seen a manatee is going to quickly realize you had to be really fucking drunk to think that's a woman.
Yeah.
But there's a reason why that explanation makes sense in exactly one sighting of mermaids. There's a description in the logs of the navigator on Christopher Columbus's ships of how in 1693, Columbus had gone to the island of Hispaniola, which is now modern-day Haiti. And Columbus claimed to have seen manatees, but to have been surprised because they were quite a bit more masculine and rotund than he had been expecting. Or not manatees, mermaids. That is the right part of the world. That is a much more accurate description. What he saw was almost certainly manatees. That raises the question, though, what are all the other sightings describing if it's not manatees?
Seals.
Or dolphins. Also, both of which also don't look a lot like women.
No, but sometimes it could be the noises they make.
But there's an explanation. Well, the reason I bring this up is there is in fact an explanation that doesn't require the existence of watery women. It fits entirely within the secular worldview. So here's the thing. If you're standing very close to the waterline, like on the shore, or on a ship, like a Viking longship, because the thing about long ships is the deck was often on the same level as the water, or even a little bit lower than it. And if it's just before the beginning of a thunderstorm, it can cause a sort of atmospheric distortion, an optical illusion on objects floating on or on the surface of the water. One that can make them look very human-like. And hide the catnap. Now, if we remember our mermaid folklore a little, one, commonly cited among the Vikings. Like I said, Viking longships actually often rode below the deck was below the surface of the water. Two, seeing a mermaid or hearing a mermaid sing is traditionally a sign of a storm coming. Now, one, like I said, the conditions for this optical illusion to occur are just before a thunderstorm. Two, aside from the fact that whales and dolphins both make very musical sounds, on the deck of a sailing ship, when the wind picks up, the way the sails and rigging whips around in the wind can sound like music. This fits the stories of mermaids much better than manatees. Is entirely based in the real world. But because skeptics stopped at the first easy explanation, it gets overlooked. And instead we have this ridiculous idea that a huge whiskered creature is what some very drunk sailors thought was a woman. It also helps because in some mermaid legends they have a tail. In other mermaid legends, they actually are just women. They have regular human feet. Or maybe the feet and the arms or hands are slightly webbed. But they're not flippers.
Yeah, and a lot of times they drag you down to your death.
Yeah, which is a little more common with sirens than mermaids, but mermaids do it as well.
Yeah.
And the line between what's a siren and what's a mermaid isn't exactly drawn in the sand, as it were.
Yeah. There's a vampiric element to early mermaid legends where they would drag you down and drink your blood.
And then there's the related entities known as selkies, which are a little werewolf-like because they're women that put on the skins of seals to turn into seals. But you can domesticate them by capturing or destroying the seal skin. So there's a few stories of is it selkies or Osaka? But there are stories of men that took these creatures as wives because they got a hold of the skin. And yes, Catnat, there is the aquatic ape theory, but I'm not familiar enough with it to go into it. But the last thing, because we're coming up on the end of the hour, and given we're going to get it shut off anyway, I kind of want to try and wrap things up. The last thing I wanted to get into is there's a creature from Native American legend that often gets associated with cryptids that I think is more accurately associated with demons. And hello, Kimber in Alaska. And the creature I'm talking about is the Wendigo. For those of you who may not know, because it's a slightly obscure creature, the Wendigo is what happens when someone is caught out, usually in a survival situation, and is forced to turn to cannibalism to survive. Eating the flesh of another human being is taboo in many cultures, and particularly among the Algonquin tribes, which is where the legends of the Wendigo originate. But supposedly it changes you, the person who eats it, into this immortal creature that has this endless gnawing hunger. Now, because it's described as this creature that is constantly hungry, it's often associated with cryptids. But in some of the Native American stories about them, they're spirits.
Yeah.
There are spirits that are known as the Wendigo that possess people. And where this ties in well with the demonology is specifically, again, cannibalism in these societies is considered very taboo. It's a huge, to put it in a Judeo-Christian term, sin. Committing this crime opens the door for the Wendigo spirit to possess your body. And the spirit makes these changes and turns you into this creature. I've talked to people that claim to have encountered not physical Wendigo, but at least the spirits of Wendigo. And I'm personally very much of the opinion that it's some sort of demonic spirit. Or possibly it's some sort of nature spirit. There's also some implications that while they're very, very dangerous, they can serve as guardians. But again, it's a good example, and it's something we've talked about many times before, that the reality is people today, mostly because of popular fiction, tend to think of you have vampires, and you have werewolves, and you have witches, and you have demons, and you have fairies, and ever the five shall meet. But as we've talked about, and of course you're well aware, Brian, the lines where one ends and the other begin are barely there let alone well drawn.
Yeah, it's true.
There are plenty of creatures that, like the striga. There are Eastern European cultures that describe them as witches. There are ones that describe them as vampires. There's ones that describe them as a little bit of both. There's ones that describe them as demons. There's all sorts of different explanations of what vampires are.
Yeah.
And demon possession is or something like demon possession is a fairly common one. But I think that's going to just about wrap it up. Although, heck, we've beaten the hour mark without getting knocked off. But I don't really want to push our luck.
Yeah. You should remind them again about the schedule change.
We're just about to. So, folks, I do want to remind everyone that starting next week, this will be on the 23rd. The show is moving to Monday nights. It'll still be 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But my work schedule has changed. I will no longer be off. I got a new job. I'm getting a